like somebody I know. There's a picture there. Not going to be tuning in tonight on account of Bert the Man Rutan speaking at 8, but I have a personal question. I'll look for it in the playback. When Mike says, hey, where'd you get that shirt? Do you A, tell him about your 20-year obsession, or B, give him the shirt off your back? He sent a picture of Mike. And Mike says, hey, where'd you get that shirt? Oh, I see. Mike Melville gets whatever he damn well wants from me. We had an initial problem with the engine on the Long Easy when I first got it. And the engine and the little problem is it stopped running. And the reason it stopped running was it had blown a cylinder on the way out here, and they'd replace a cylinder. The owner, builder owner, and an A&P mechanic, I don't remember where, middle of the country someplace, replaced the cylinder, and because there were two people working on it, somebody didn't tighten the screws that hold on the, the input manifold, I think. So the thing was just running incredibly rough, and it was running incredibly rough because it was only running on 3 cylinders, and those cylinders weren't timed easily because air was getting in places it shouldn't have gotten in, and so on and so forth. And I didn't know what to do about this. We thought maybe it was bad plugs, bad mags. We checked all this stuff. And so Mike frickin' Melville gets in his Long Easy, comes down to my hangar. We spend an hour and a half checking mags, checking all of this other stuff. And then we did all that with the top cowl off and the bottom cowl was still on. And then Mike says, this is just weird. Let's take the bottom cowl off and see if we can find anything down there. So we're unscrewing the bottom cowl, which is what covers the engine on the back of the plane. And he points down, and resting on the cowl as if it had been aligned like for a photo shoot or something, as I recall, was a gasket and two nuts. And he said, did you put those there? I said, no. He says, I know what your problem is. You're going to be flying in 10 minutes. So we just put that thing back on, bolted it on, and it ran great. But, Mike Melville flew down from Tehachapi to do that. Needless to say, wouldn't take any money for it. I felt duty-bound to offer it, but once he said, no, I'm not going to argue with him, that can be insulting. But I did get to take him out to lunch and hear some amazing true tales of adventure. And his true tales of adventure trumped mine, needless to say. The one I remember the most about from Mike Melville, was Scaled Composites developed. I think this is the only actual warplane prototype they developed. But they had a design for a ground attack aircraft called the Ares, and it was a really cool looking design, very lightweight, but it had a big gun in it. It didn't have the same gun that the A-10 has. I don't think anything has that gun, but it had a regular Vulcan Gatling gun, the kind of thing we put on regular fighters. And since this plane was made out of fiberglass, and that was part of the appeal of it, it had very low radar signature. Cool looking thing. But it had the gun was mounted off axis, and as I recall, the muzzle of the gun was just slightly behind the pilot. On the A-10, obviously, it's right at the very front of the jet. And I remember Mike Melville telling me he was doing the flight test for this, when you're doing the fly-off for the government evaluation. And he said, I would roll in on a target, and I'd have the target lined up, and I'd pull the trigger on the gun. He said, and I felt like the airplane had hit a brick wall. Like I just, boom, like that. Because the recoil from the gun on such a low mass airplane, he said it was like it's like you just flew into the ground. It was just boom, and that wasn't much fun. So anyway, yeah, Mike Melville is great, and I'll tell you who else doesn't get enough credit, and who did write to me about this, and that's Bert's brother Dick, who is the man who flew Voyager around the world. He sent me an advance copy of his book about Voyager. That alone would make an excellent podcast, make a great hour, the Voyager flight. I saw Dick give a speech. He invited me out to a Boy Scout thing at Oshkosh. It would be summer of 2015, I want to say. And he flew there in the Starship, which was great. I got to sit in the front seat, got to be in the air show. We talked about that before. Dick Rutan asked me to go with him when he talked to these Boy Scouts, and so I got to spend 3-4 hours with Dick Rutan, and he was great, and he had some amazing stories, just absolutely amazing stories. So what the heck is this? Just somebody linked a quote to a book in the Master Brigade. Choose a renegade scientist, spies who sabotage the knowledge. Oh, interesting. Anyway, yeah, Mike is a great guy, and Dick is a great guy, and that movie would be great. I can just tell you little bits of stuff, and this is not, violating anything, because these things I heard Dick say during his talk about Voyager. It was the 25th anniversary or something. 1986 is when it flew. And the two things I remember Dick saying was that he had, the plane was extremely unstable, very difficult to fly. The two booms filled with fuel, the wings were filled with fuel, very, very long, high aspect ratio wings because they were more efficient, and efficiency was everything. So the Voyager, as usual for Burt Rutan, the Voyager was built to climb out on two engines, and then once they got to cruising altitude, they turned the front engine off because they're not looking for speed; they're just looking for mileage. But when the plane was, especially when the plane was full, there was so much weight of the aircraft was outboard in the wings and in the empennages, that until they burned off a significant amount of fuel, like 3 or 4 days about it, if the Voyager hit any kind of turbulence at all, the wings would go up, and then the center would go up, and the wings would go down, and it would start to get into this wing flapping oscillation, and it was not what's the word I'm looking for? Something stable. It was. The feedback on it was positive. It wasn't a negative feedback. In other words, it got worse and worse instead of getting better and better. I find out Dick is on stage now talking about Voyager. So because this thing was so unstable, he did the flight with Jenna Yeager, who was his girlfriend when they were raising the money, but they'd broken up by the time it became time to fly. And so he spent, 9 days, I guess, in a phone booth with his ex-girlfriend. But it was, it was supposed to be like two people, a two-person flight. She'd fly, he'd fly, she'd fly, he'd fly. And he said it was just crystal clear real early that she just didn't have the stick skill. She didn't have the feel for it. Some people can become pilots, and they just do it through instruments and like a mental thing, and other people just feel the airplane. And I remember my flight instructor in gliders told me that after the second or third lesson. It's like, no, you feel it. I can hold a plane a knot. 1 knot is a nautical mile an hour. It's 1 mile per hour basically above a stall. I could hold it above a stall all day. I could just feel it getting ready to go. Some people couldn't do that. And anyway, so she was one of those people who he couldn't. He's in the air. They're going around the world. He's going to be out for 9 days. And he realizes after they go through their first turbulence, a couple hours into the flight, that he's going to have to fly this whole thing. He's going to have to fly the whole thing. And that's a challenge. So the couple stories that I remember Dick telling, one of them was he was going down the runway on this thing. And Bert and Dick had an agreement, like a serious, genuine, blood brothers, slit your palm, kind of serious, honest to God agreement that if the aircraft was not at a certain speed at a certain point down the runway, might have been the halfway point, if it wasn't there, if it didn't have this airspeed at that time, then you're going to abort the takeoff because it will not get off the ground. And Dick is doing the takeoff, and he's rolling this thing down there, and he's slowly accelerating. And sure enough, he got to that intersection, and he was 3 or 4 knots too slow. And he kept going. That's Dick. Got the thing off the ground. But the two things I remember most clearly was, one of them was he's coming back. So they flew west. Yeah. So they immediately start out across the Pacific. And he said, so we're coming across Africa from East Africa to West Africa. And he's been flying for 5-6 days now. And he said he was so tired that the instrument panel was bulging towards him. He could see it just like bulging, like it was going to hit him in the face. So he had a rudimentary autopilot, and they had a turn point. It's like turn point 22 or something coming up on their course, and the turn point was like 45 minutes ahead or something. And so Dick is still at the controls, and he says to Jenna, he says, "Listen, I'm going to sleep for 20 minutes, okay? You wake me up at this point. You have to wake me up at this point." Okay. Second, she says, "Okay, he's out. He's just gone." And some time passes, and he wakes up, and he looks at the time, and he's been sleeping for almost like an hour and a half, 2 hours. He says, "What happened?" She said, "You just looked so comfortable, and the air was smooth. I just didn't want to wake you. You needed to sleep so bad." He goes, "Jesus Christ." And he checks his position, and he's 4 minutes from flying into a mountain or something that he knew he had to climb to avoid, and that's why he said, "You've got to wake me up in 20 minutes. It just came, he said we were 4 or 5 minutes away from just making a greasy spot on the side of a hill. So that is quite a story, and he's a great guy, and I've talked a little bit about some of the things he did in Vietnam and said, but we're not going to repeat that right now. So moving along.